What do you do when you realize there is no way to escape certain death? Today's story offers a gripping and heart-wrenching account of what United States Navy sailors did in this exact situation. But before we dive into this tale of bravery and survival, let me introduce myself. I am Mr. Anda, and this is the H-Files, a place where history comes alive through the art of storytelling. So, if you're ready to embark on a journey through time, buckle up and get ready for an unforgettable ride. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss any of my future stories. Now, let's delve into today's episode and discover the true meaning of courage in the face of certain death. The sense of urgency in Skipper Lansdowne's voice was impossible to ignore as he shouted into the speaking tube, "All hands, emergency posts. All hands, emergency posts." He turned to his second in command, Rosendahl, and said, "We need to bring the nose down quickly. If we don't, we're in big trouble." The girders inside the ship's frame had already started to twist out of shape from the intense strain. Head back and jettison any water or fuel we can to lighten the tail. With a quick half salute, Rosendahl made his way up the bucking companionway, his heart racing with adrenaline as he entered the inside of the framework. As he moved back along the ship's keel, he was suddenly struck by a multitude of sounds that filled his ears with a deafening roar. The noise was so intense that it felt like it was shaking the very core of the ship, with sharp snapping sounds and straining, protesting squeals that seemed to come from every direction. It was as if he had been thrust into the heart of a raging storm, with the sound of the wind howling around him and the creaking of the ship's timbers echoing in the air. The roar of the surf was mixed with the sound of metal bending and twisting, as if some unseen force was tearing the ship apart. In that moment, Rosendahl knew with a heavy heart that the fate of the Shenandoah had been sealed. He couldn't help but wonder how many of his fellow crew members would meet their end together with the doomed ship as they hurtled towards an uncertain fate. The U.S.S. Shenandoah was on the brink of disaster. The ship was listing dangerously, and the crew was struggling to maintain control. The situation was so dire that even the most experienced sailors on board were terrified. First Lieutenant Anderson was doing everything he could to keep the ship afloat, but two faulty valves were causing chaos with their ballast. As the ship's commander, Lansdowne, knew that they were in real trouble, he staggered his way to the radio room and ordered Schnitzer, the radio officer, to send a distress signal to headquarters. "Tell them we can't ride this out." But despite Schnitzer's best efforts, the contact was weak, and they were unable to get through. "They can't read us, sir," Schnitzer reported. Lansdowne knew that time was running out. He turned to Anderson and gave him a direct order. "Lieutenant, you'll have to go topside. Commandeer all the men you need. Blow all cells, but start with the forward ones first. We have to do everything we can to save this ship." It was a make-or-break moment for the entire crew. The fate of the ship hung in the balance, and they had to act fast if they wanted to survive. The tension was palpable as Anderson replied, "Aye, sir." As Commander Lansdowne and his men fought for their lives, a different scene was unfolding in a small and peaceful farm town called Caldwell, nestled in Noble County, Ohio. The violent storm that had raged outside all night had kept Mr. and Mrs. Gamara awake, leaving them feeling tired and drained. Mrs. Gamara had mentioned to her husband that she could hear airplane engines overhead for the last half hour, but he dismissed her claims as impossible, especially given that it was only 5 in the morning and the stormy weather outside. Airplanes were a rare and uncommon sight in their area, and no one around their farm could afford such a luxury in 1925. However, just as Mr. Gamara was about to rise from bed, he heard it too, the sound of engines overhead. Curiosity and anxiety got the better of them. They both got up, dressed, and went outside to investigate. Against the dark, ominous clouds, they glimpsed a sight that left them awestruck and bewildered. A colossal dirigible, an airship of unbelievable size, loomed in the distance, silhouetted by flashes of lightning. Its silver skin glistened in the eerie light, and the sound of its engines echoed through the air. Despite the fear and uncertainty that gripped them, they couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the airship, a sight that they knew they would never forget. The Gamaras had absolutely no idea that this enormous airship, the USS Shenandoah, measuring 680 feet in length and weighing a staggering 37 tons, had embarked on a goodwill mission to the Midwestern states the previous day. On September 2nd, 1925, the airship set out from Lakehurst, New Jersey, with 43 officers and men on board, headed to St. Louis, Missouri, for an air show, followed by stops in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Dearborn, Michigan, before returning to the East Coast. Little did they know that the airship was fighting for its very survival. Despite boasting 6 powerful 300 horsepower Packard engines, capable of reaching a top speed of 70 miles per hour, the USS Shenandoah was rendered completely helpless, with zero maneuverability. The crew was struggling to keep the massive airship under control, and with each passing moment, the situation was growing increasingly dire. Aviation machinist mate, Ralph Jones, was busy working in engine room number 3, his eyes fixed on the control car. He felt a growing sense of concern as the gondola was being jolted with increasing severity. Jones couldn't shake off his fear that a fuel line might rupture and start a fire, but his primary concern was the erratic signals coming from the control car. The commands were unpredictable, and the airship's movements were becoming more chaotic with each passing moment. Despite carrying out orders, it seemed to make no difference to the giant airship's movements. Jones had estimated that they should have been over mid-Pennsylvania by that time, but in reality, the airship was fighting against strong winds some 3,000 feet over the Gamarras farm in Caldwell, Ohio. Suddenly, without warning, the airship plunged into a gigantic current of warm air rising skyward, and the gondola was tossed about like a leaf in a tempest. Rosendahl shouted in disbelief, "Good God, look at our rate of climb." Within seconds, the altimeter registered an ascent of 21,000 feet, and the airship was rapidly losing control. The men in the control cabin struggled to maintain their balance as the airship rose like an express elevator and their legs buckling beneath them. They were fighting like hell to level her out, but the airship was bucking and weaving with increasing ferocity. As they battled to regain control, the cold air inside the control car suddenly became warm. Rosendahl realized that this was no small updraft, but a powerful mass rising all the way from some Ohio hillside. Far below, this new, sudden current of air rising from below lifted the Shenandoah's 37-ton ship as though it was a mere feather. Lieutenant Anderson had been frantically working the valves, but as the ship started to rise again, he realized that valves 6 and 8 were stuck. He couldn't seem to free them. Chaos erupted as the control cabin careened wildly, and orders were barely heard above the snapping and screaming of the cables that supported it beneath the ship. Commander Lansdowne's urgent voice pierced through the chaos, screaming into the speaking tube, calling all hands to emergency posts and instructing his second-in-command, Rosendahl, that they had to get the ship's nose down fast, or else they would break up for sure. Inside the frame, the girders were twisting from the strain overhead. Everyone on board knew the Shenandoah was being pushed past its limits. Lansdowne turned to Anderson and ordered him to go topside and commandeer all the men he needed to blow all sails, starting with the forward ones first. With the fate of the Shenandoah hanging in the balance, Anderson, feeling the weight of the urgency, headed off to carry out his orders. Anderson, a seasoned airship engineer, felt his life flash before his eyes as he swung from the ladder between the cabin and the airship, the wind whipping through his hair as he struggled to keep his grip. He could hear the helmsman, a trusted friend, shouting that the control cable had snapped and the ship wasn't responding to the wheel. The horrible sound of ripping fabric filled the air, and the voices from the control cabin, where his friends and fellow crew members were, suddenly trailed off. Anderson turned around just in time to witness a horrifying sight. A great open hole where the control cabin was once perched. Far below, he could see the streamlined shape of the cabin plummeting downward. His heart pounding in his chest, Anderson realized that he was the last person to leave the control cabin. He had managed to escape just in time. A wave of panic and helplessness crashed over him as he watched the cabin fall to its doom, his mind filled with the image of his friends and the sound of their voices, now silenced forever. Lieutenant Commander Rosendahl, who was nearby, with a small team of men he had gathered to jettison the heavy fuel drums, turned towards Anderson with a puzzled look. With a gasp, Anderson informed him that the control cabin had torn loose and Lansdowne and the others were gone. Rosendahl was about to speak when a sudden, earth-shattering crash sent both of them tumbling around the scaffolding. The girders that held the airship in place were now buckling, and the once beautiful fabric of the ship was now tearing apart right before their eyes. The scene was both awe-inspiring and terrifying as they watched the once glorious airship being ripped to shreds. As machinist mate Jones remained stationed in engine room number 3, he couldn't help but feel increasingly anxious about the ship's sudden ascent. He had initially heard the frantic emergency calls blaring through the intercom, but then the communication abruptly went silent. However, the ship's descent now felt alarmingly swift. Jones struggled to maintain his balance as he slowly made his way towards the hatch, carefully opening it. Suddenly, a colossal gust of wind surged through, overpowering the deafening roar of the Packard engines. What he witnessed before him was a sight that instantly triggered fear within him. The ship's exterior had been ripped apart, and twisted girders protruded through the shredded fabric. Astonishingly, the entire front section of the ship had vanished. Looking downward, he noticed patches of farmland that were rapidly approaching. Amidst the chaos and destruction of the Shenandoah, Cook John J. Hann struggled to get back on his feet after being knocked down in the kitchen. Chief Gunner Cole cried out in despair as he desperately clung to a girder above the engine room. "Did you see that? We're breaking apart," aviation pilot Masters added to the panic, his voice trembling with fear. "The whole nose is gone. The whole goddamn ship is about to break apart," Masters exclaimed. But the cook tried to remain calm as he replied, "It already has, boys. Now all we can do is pray we have enough helium in the bags to set us down gently." As the ship spun faster and faster, Cole held on tightly to the girder and watching the ground rise up at an alarming rate. Masters asked, "How high up are we?" "I guess maybe 1,000 feet, Han replied. As the ship plunged towards the ground, the men on board could see the world below rushing up to meet them. They could make out the shapes of familiar landmarks like roads, a farmhouse, and even 2 figures staring up at them. These figures were Mr. and Mrs. Gamara, who had been watching in horror as the control cabin was ripped from the ship. They could hear the sound of the cabin crashing into a hillside nearby. They watched helplessly as the rest of the ship hurtled towards the ground, seemingly oblivious to the danger that it posed to their own safety. In a moment of sheer terror, the Shenandoah began to crumble into 1,000 pieces right before the eyes of the brave men on board. They clung onto the twisted girders for dear life as the ship plummeted towards the earth, finally crashing into a clump of trees. The deafening sound of metal ripping apart filled the air as they braced themselves for the worst. As the dust began to settle, they realized with a shiver that they were still alive, trapped inside a mangled mess. With grit and determination, they started to climb and slide down ropes, inch by inch, finally freeing themselves from the wreckage of the ship that nearly became their tomb. The scene was chaotic, with debris from the Shenandoah scattered across the area. The lieutenant, upon landing, quickly took charge and ordered his men to secure the site to prevent any explosions. He was already thinking ahead, knowing that an inquiry into the crash would be coming. Inquiring from the Gamaras, he learned the approximate location of the other parts of the ship that had landed elsewhere. Without wasting any time, he headed out at a run, and by 8 in the morning, he had reached the area, 12 miles away, where the main body of the ship had crash landed. The sight that met him was devastating. The wreckage was extensive, but he pushed forward and began to count the survivors. All 29 were still alive, but 2 men needed emergency care. As they walked towards the wreck of the cabin, Lieutenant Rosendahl asked one of his officers if anyone had survived in the control cabin after it hit. The reply was bleak, "No, sir." The lieutenant then asked if the officer could identify Lansdowne's body, as he needed to contact his wife. The officer replied that he could only identify the body due to his uniform, as the cabin was completely destroyed. After a thorough investigation by the Navy, it was concluded that future airships needed to be reinforced to withstand severe weather conditions. However, within a decade, the Navy decided to focus on airplanes instead and abandoned its airships. The story of the Shenandoah airship may have been a tragic one, but it is also a testament to the bravery and resilience of its crew. Despite facing incredible challenges and severe weather conditions, the crew members did everything in their power to survive the ordeal, and many of them made it out alive. For their determination and bravery, serve as an inspiration to us all to never give up, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Today, we can pay our respects to those who lost their lives and learn from their example of courage and perseverance. The 3 preserved crash sites in Caldwell, Ohio, in Noble County, serve as a reminder of this significant moment in history and a tribute to the crew's bravery. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed today's story. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you won't miss out on my future stories. As always, thank you for watching. I am Mr. Anda, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.